The summer air was heavy, filled with the warm scent of freshly cut grass and the occasional burst of laughter echoing from a nearby park. It was a small town tucked away in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. The streets were quiet, lined with old brick houses and white picket fences, and life here rarely strayed from its routine. Kids rode their bikes along the sidewalks, parents watered their gardens, and the town rolled on like clockwork. But beneath its peaceful surface, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. The town had an unspoken rule: people stuck to their own. The divide wasn't something you could see on a map, but it was there in the way certain kids only played in certain neighborhoods, in the uneasy glances exchanged at the grocery store, in the whispered words behind closed doors. For as long as anyone could remember, this was just the way things were. That's why, on one particular Saturday afternoon, when a stranger rolled into town, heads turned. His arrival was hard to miss. A motorcycle, jet black and gleaming in the sunlight, roared down the main street like a thunderstorm cutting through the calm. The rider wore a matching black leather jacket, his face obscured by a sleek helmet. He wasn't from here, that much was obvious. People paused in their tracks, squinting at him as he sped by, the engine growling like a warning. A group of boys lounging near the old diner watched him with a mix of curiosity and something sharper, something close to hostility. They were teenagers, barely old enough to drive, but old enough to feel the pull of the unwritten rules that shaped their town. Their leader, a boy named Ryan, leaned against the diner wall with his arms crossed. He had a cocky smirk that masked the unease flickering in his eyes. "Who does he think he is?" Ryan muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Probably lost," one of the other boys said with a shrug, but Ryan wasn't convinced. The motorcycle came to a stop at the edge of town, right near the community center that hadn't been used in years. The rider dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and removed his helmet. He was tall, with dark skin and a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His gaze swept over the empty parking lot, lingering on the cracked pavement and the faded paint of the building's walls. For a moment, it seemed like time itself held its breath. The stranger didn't say a word, but there was something about him. Something that felt like a challenge, or maybe a promise. By the time the rider had disappeared inside the building, word had already begun to spread. Whispers traveled faster than the summer breeze, carried from porch to porch, shop to shop. Who was he? What did he want? And why here, of all places? Ryan and his friends couldn't resist the pull of their curiosity or their unease. Later that evening, they found themselves gathered near the community center, hiding behind a row of bushes as they watched the stranger through the windows. Inside, he was moving furniture, dusting off old chairs, and setting up what looked like a makeshift classroom. A large banner hung across one wall, its bold letters reading, "Unity through understanding." "What the heck is this?" one of the boys whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but it's weird." The next morning, the town woke to flyers posted on every lamppost and bulletin board. They were simple. Just a date, a time, and a few words. "Join us to learn something new." No explanation, no details. Just an open invitation. Ryan and his friends tore one down and examined it, their unease growing with every passing second. "No one's actually gonna go to this, right?" one of them said, trying to sound confident. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and by the time the sun began to set that evening, a small crowd had gathered outside the community center. Some came out of genuine interest, others out of boredom, and a few, like Ryan and his crew, came because they couldn't stand not knowing what was going on. The rider was waiting for them inside, his expression calm but unreadable. He introduced himself simply as Marcus and wasted no time diving into his message. He spoke about the power of unity, about breaking down barriers and building bridges, about seeing people for who they truly were instead of the labels society placed on them. His words were met with a mix of reactions, some nodding along, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. There was a conviction in his voice, a quiet strength that demanded attention. Even Ryan, who had come ready to scoff and sneer, found himself unable to look away. As the night wore on, Marcus shared stories, some heartbreaking, others inspiring, all tied together by a common thread: the idea that people were stronger together than apart. He didn't preach or lecture, he simply spoke, letting his words hang in the air like a challenge. And then, just as the crowd was beginning to settle into the rhythm of his voice, Marcus did something no one expected. He paused, looked directly at Ryan, and said, "Why don't you come up here and tell us what you think?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to Ryan, who froze in his seat. He hadn't planned on being part of the story, he'd come to watch, to judge, to tear it down from the sidelines. But now, with everyone watching, he had no choice but to respond. Ryan could feel the heat rising to his face as all eyes in the room turned toward him. His friends were sitting just a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their usual bravado nowhere to be found. Marcus's gaze was steady, not hostile but insistent, and Ryan knew he couldn't back out now. He cleared his throat and slowly got up, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he made his way to the front of the room. "What do I think?" Ryan said, his voice carrying just a hint of defiance. "I think this is all a waste of time." There was a ripple of murmurs from the crowd, but Marcus didn't react. He simply gestured for Ryan to continue. "I mean, what's the point?" Ryan said, his voice growing louder, more confident. "You can stand up here and talk all you want about unity or whatever, but that doesn't change how things are. People don't just forget who they are. They don't just mix." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Ryan with a calm curiosity. "And why do you think that is?" he asked. Ryan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "It's just the way things are. Some people don't get along, and that's fine. That's normal." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said, surprising everyone. "It is normal, if no one ever questions it, if no one ever tries to understand why." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Ryan didn't know how to respond. He felt a strange mix of anger and uncertainty, like the ground beneath him was shifting in ways he couldn't control. Marcus didn't push him further. Instead, he turned back to the rest of the group, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "The truth is, the divisions we cling to are often built on fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing what we think makes us special. But here's the thing. Understanding someone else doesn't take anything away from you. If anything, it adds to who you are. It makes you stronger." Ryan sat back down, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but something about Marcus' words was starting to get under his skin. Over the next few days, the community center became a strange sort of gathering place. People from all parts of town started showing up. Not just out of curiosity, but because they wanted to hear more. Marcus didn't just talk, he listened. He encouraged people to share their own stories, to talk about the experiences that shaped them. At first, the stories were small, hesitant. An older woman talked about growing up in a different town. A younger boy shared how he'd been bullied in school. But as the days went on, the stories grew deeper, more personal. A man who owned the local hardware store admitted he'd always felt out of place because of his accent. A teenager confessed she avoided certain parts of town because she didn't feel welcome there. The more people talked, the more they began to realize just how much they had in common. It wasn't always easy. Some of the stories were raw, even painful, but Marcus had a way of guiding the conversations, of keeping the focus on understanding instead of blame. Ryan, however, stayed on the sidelines. He still came to the meetings, partly because his friends did and partly because he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important happening here. But he refused to participate. He kept his distance, watching everything unfold like an outsider. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Marcus approached Ryan outside the community center. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the faint hum of cicadas filling the air. "You've got a lot to say," Marcus said finally, his tone even, "but you keep holding it back. Why?" Ryan shrugged, kicking at a loose pebble on the ground. "What's the point? No one cares what I think." "That's not true," Marcus said. "I care. And I think a lot of people in there do too." Ryan looked up at him, his expression skeptical. "Why does it matter to you so much? Why are you even here?" For the first time, Marcus' calm demeanor faltered just slightly. He looked out at the horizon, his eyes distant. "Because I've seen what happens when people let fear and hate divide them. I've seen how it tears communities apart, how it destroys lives. And I've seen what's possible when people choose a different path." He turned back to Ryan, his gaze steady. "You've got a choice too. You can stand on the sidelines, or you could be part of something bigger. It's up to you." Ryan didn't respond, but something about Marcus' words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. The next day, Ryan found himself wandering into a part of town he'd rarely visited before. It wasn't planned, his feet just seemed to take him there. The houses were older, smaller, but there was a warmth to the neighborhood he hadn't noticed before. Kids were playing on the sidewalks, their laughter ringing out into the street, and neighbors called out to each other from their porches. As he walked, Ryan spotted a boy about his age sitting on the steps of a house, strumming a guitar. The boy looked up and gave him a nod, a small but friendly gesture that caught Ryan off guard. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Nice guitar," Ryan said, his voice awkward but genuine. "Thanks," the boy replied, smiling. "You play?" "A little," Ryan admitted, sitting down on the steps. For the next hour, the two of them talked about music, about school, about the town. It was easy, natural, and Ryan couldn't help but wonder why he'd never had a conversation like this before. As the days went on, Ryan started to see the town in a new light. The lines that had once seemed so solid, so unchangeable, began to blur. He still wasn't sure where he fit into all of this, but for the first time, he was open to finding out. But not everyone in town was ready for change. Whispers of resistance began to surface, small, sharp comments muttered under breaths, cold stares exchanged across streets. And one night, as Marcus was locking up the community center, he found a spray-painted message on the wall. "Go back to where you came from." The sight of it stopped him in his tracks, but it didn't shake him. If anything, it made him more determined. Ryan saw the message the next morning and felt a surge of anger he didn't fully understand. He realized then that this wasn't just Marcus's fight, it was his too. And that's when the tension reached its breaking point, setting the stage for a confrontation that would force everyone in town to confront their own fears, their own choices, and their own capacity for change. The spray-painted words on the community center wall lingered in everyone's minds like an unwelcome shadow. For some, it was a reminder of the resistance to change, to unity. For others, it was a call to action, a sign that they couldn't ignore the divide any longer. Ryan stood in front of the wall early that morning, staring at the harsh letters in silence. His fists were clenched, and his jaw was tight. He didn't know why it made him so angry. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he could see the ugliness behind the rules he had followed his whole life. Or maybe it was because he knew the people who did this wouldn't stop here. When Marcus arrived a few moments later, he looked at the graffiti with calm eyes but said nothing. Instead, he walked into the building, grabbed a bucket of paint and a roller, and started covering it up. He didn't ask for help, didn't try to make a statement, he just worked. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then grabbed another roller from the supply closet and joined him. They worked side by side in silence, their movements steady and deliberate. Before long, other people from the town began to show up. First a few, then a dozen, until the parking lot was filled with people holding paintbrushes and buckets. By the time the wall was clean, the crowd had grown quiet. Marcus stood in front of them, the faintest smile on his face. "It's not about the wall," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone. "It's about what kind of community we want to be. This isn't just my fight, it's all of ours. So the question is, what are we going to do about it?" Ryan felt a strange sense of pride in that moment, standing among people he'd once thought he had nothing in common with. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going back to the way things were. But not everyone felt the same. That night, as the town settled into its usual quiet, a group of boys, older, meaner, gathered outside the community center. Ryan recognized a few of them. He heard the way they talked, seen the way they looked at people who didn't fit their mold. They weren't just angry. They were looking to make a statement of their own. Ryan happened to be walking by when he saw them. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched them pull out cans of spray paint, laughing and jeering. He knew he should walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something in him snapped. "Hey," he called out, his voice cracking with nerves but louder than he expected. The boys turned, their laughter fading. "What do you want?" one of them sneered. Ryan swallowed hard, his palms sweating. "You can't do this," he said, stepping closer. "This isn't who we are." One of the boys stepped forward, towering over Ryan. "What do you mean, we? You think you're better than us now? Hanging out with them?" Ryan's hands shook, but he didn't back down. "I'm not better than anyone," he said, his voice steadier now. "But I know this is wrong, and deep down you do too." For a moment, it seemed like the tension would boil over, but then a voice cut through the night. Marcus, standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. "Is this what you want to be remembered for?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Is this the legacy you want to leave behind?" The boys hesitated, their bravado faltering. One by one, they lowered their cans of spray paint. They didn't say anything, just shuffled away into the darkness. Ryan let out a shaky breath, his adrenaline crashing all at once. Marcus walked over to him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said quietly. "I did," Ryan replied. "Because if I didn't, nothing would change." The next day, the community center was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds came together, not just to talk but to take action. They organized events, started programs, and worked to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but slowly the town began to transform. Ryan found himself at the center of it all. Not because he wanted to be a leader, but because he believed in what they were doing. He and Marcus worked side by side, along with countless others, to build something new, something better. Months later, as Ryan stood in front of the community center, now vibrant and full of life, he thought back to that first meeting, to the moment Marcus had called him out. He realized now that it wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. The town wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But it was trying, and that made all the difference. And as the sun set over the little town, Ryan knew one thing for certain: unity wasn't just a word, it was a choice, one they would have to make every single day. And for the first time, he felt proud to be part of it.